Lords of the Fallen is out, and with it, obviously, we get a brand new soundtrack to explore and listen to. I spent some time with the soundtrack this week and came away with some really interesting thoughts on whether or not Lords of the Fallen is worth playing for the music alone. The answer is, of course, yes, but I wanted to explain why in greater detail. The soundtrack actually transcends a lot of the common tropes that we hear when we look at Soulsborne music. Instead of there being a lot of dissonance, we actually end up with a lot of choral singing, both operatic, throat singing, and also just traditional liturgical part writing. We dive into melodic intricacies and profound emotional impact that creates discomfort and also beauty. So you listen to a video game soundtrack and you divorce yourself from the context of the game itself. What do you look for? For many of us, we look about melodic integrity, rhythmic structure, and a way to decipher emotions in a very obvious way. And that's the beauty of what video game soundtracks can evoke. They allow us to feel feelings. It's a quest for musical depth that transcends mere enjoyment and about really the depths of the human experience when we play video games. And they may sound like hyperbole, but the fact of the matter is that video game music enraptures us, and especially in games that are difficult or challenging, where we're facing against monstrous entities of violence and malevolence, we sometimes need music to not only bolster us, but to also provide us with a feeling of fear and discomfort. So we can look at music in a couple different ways. From a micro way with individual tracks, and from a macro way, Marco Meatball, where we look at soundtracks on the whole. And in this way, both from a micro and a macro level, we can reveal the multifaceted brilliance of Lords of the Fallen soundtrack. The soundtrack of Lords of the Fallen relies super heavily on the power of the chorus. In fact, I would say that the chorus is the cornerstone of this soundtrack. When we hear a choir, we often associate it with liturgical, choral, or religious contexts. This correlation brings a sense of holiness to the music, really. But here's the twist. That same chorus can also convey malevolence and danger depending on the context and depending on how the music is written. The soundtrack employs beautifully structured choral pieces, reminiscent of classical symphonic compositions like the Duraflay Requiem, playing with our expectations. One of the really cool parts about Lords of the Fallen is its extensive use of orchestration. There's a real organic quality to the music, and I often find that missing in modern music. There's a real feeling of a composition that is written for the symphonic stage. This reliance on real instruments capable of diverse rhythms and melodies brings a real true feeling of humanity and a human touch to the composition, which to me sets it apart from a lot of other synthetic music that we hear day to day, especially in video games, where sometimes we can get away with some of that synthetic quality. And in that sense, string instruments, which are a hallmark of classical music, take the center stage in this particular soundtrack. They dance to a rhythm entirely on their own, using techniques like tremolo to strike fear in the listener's heart. The juxtaposition of their organic sounds with other elements creates a unique immersive experience that only real orchestration can truly provide. And in that sense, this soundtrack's evolution of classical music is both intriguing and satisfying. It straddles that line between modern and classical. It feels like compositions from 100 years ago, but we also get this modern, fresh approach in the way that we're writing. The choral writing has a deep emphasis on vowels. Oohs and ahs create this sense of scale and size and a sense of largeness vertically. Yet the music's clever use of consonants actually intensifies feelings of tension and fear when it comes time for a chant or some sort of whispered thing, which is very predominant in this soundtrack, where we're using the human voice in many different ways to create all sorts of different emotions, whether it's oh, ha, he, ha, or we're and then one of the most interesting parts about that, and surprising parts about that, is how Lords of the Fallen actually includes a lot of throat singing throughout this soundtrack. I think that the throat singing is really interesting because it involves long, sustained notes that create a unique sense of tension, especially when juxtaposed with heavy rhythmic elements. The throat singing feels unnatural, feels supernatural, which ties me back to the idea of whispering. Whispering is actually used a lot in this soundtrack. We have an overuse of articulation, and it's like if you're in a dark room and you hear this, you're automatically going to be uncomfortable and be afraid. That's really exciting because we're essentially taking throat singing, whispering, proper choral singing, operatic singing from a mezzo-soprano or a soprano, I'm not sure which one, and we are able to connect all the different ways that humans can create fear through the use of their voices. There's a standout track to me, Hollowed Punisher, which features a mezzo-soprano or a soprano, I'm not entirely sure, that has this beautiful, precise, fully classically trained vibrato that it just sings over the top of this chorus. This rhythm underneath that moves us towards a sense of fear and wrath and danger, and yet this soprano, in that warm, rich quality of her voice, it makes us feel like we're being held, even though we're inherently afraid of what we're experiencing in the context of the game. There's actually a bunch of tracks in Lords of the Fallen that evoke this relentless cat and mouse chase sequence. You're pursued by an overwhelming force while desperately maneuvering to survive. You get those scary, scary strings. Boop, 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 boop. The music creates an atmosphere of being left for dead, intensifying that heart-pounding experience of playing the game. And shockingly so, the soundtrack actually manages to avoid falling into the trap of repetitiveness. One of the things that I think a lot of these types of Souls-like games, or really video games in general, fall into the problem of looping and fall into the problem of excessive repetition. While there is a lot of recurring rhythmic intensity, each track actually has a different emotion to convey that it does so on its own. Each of these tracks could stand alone, and you wouldn't feel like they're all from Lords of the Fallen, which is really, really nice. That said, there is a little bit of synthetic. The track Rotting Whispers, we actually hear in the percussion section an extra little bit of synthetic elements in there with the soprano soloist and with the chorus that do give a little bit of like a feeling of discomfort and fear. It really raises it just a slight bit. So we're using synthetic elements, but in a healthy and practical way to cause the feeling of haunting and terror. But what's interesting is that at the same time, Lords of the Fallen offers a unique perspective on boss battles because it doesn't necessarily always have tracks that are terrifying. In fact, in Anathema Phase 1, there's a sense of majesty and reverence, which is very clearly a boss battle. Now, I haven't seen any of this in context, but it really feels like you're coming face to face with a god, and instead of that terror, we actually feel this arrival of, I don't know, like blessings. And it's positive and major, and it's in a way almost uplifting, which I don't know how many Souls games you've played, but in Soulsborne games, we do not have uplifting music almost ever. And in this particular instance, it actually feels really fresh and shockingly surprising. That said though, the thing that continues to be interesting about boss battles in these particular types of games is the rhythmic violence and the primal nature of a lot of these tracks. There's a track, The Twice Ordained. The chanting and percussion evoke like a literal inhumane and ruthless quality to them. It's reminiscent of an era where rules and morality had like little sway. It feels like society's collapsed and we're just left with this bloodlust. It's very scary. The primal aspect connects the listener to their own primal instincts, I think, invoking a sense of discomfort and of fear. So to me, what really sets apart Lords of the Fallen is the use of this choral singing, which, yes, we've had choral singing in tons of games, but for whatever reason, in this, there's a traditional way of writing 4-part harmony that feels in line with something that you would hear, not in a video game, but you would hear out in the world in a symphonic stage. And I think in that sense, it borrows from classical music, but it also becomes its own thing. And that's the beauty of video games on the whole when it comes to video game music. But especially in Lords of the Fallen, I feel like this soundtrack feels, like I mentioned earlier, extremely organic, extremely fresh, extremely natural. It invokes a sense of inherent curiosity, weird, uncomfortable beauty about it. And so you ask me if a game is worth playing for the music alone. And honestly, like, I've been sort of on the fence about Lords of the Fallen, but after listening to the soundtrack, I am very intrigued to hear how this music will go in context, because it really is something that we don't hear very often. There's a track, Howl of Devastation, where the howl is actually the soprano singing. It invokes a sense of malignancy and fear, yet the music remains tonal despite its rhythmic intensity. There's also a piece near the end of the game that literally is a trio between throat singing in the same range as a cello with a soprano over top. Like, that's just unheard of. It's visceral, it's violent, it's uncomfortable, but it's not done in a way that's full of dissonance and full of like clashing notes. It's done in a very traditional writing kind of way that it doesn't assault the ears, even though it does make us uncomfortable and make us afraid. It's actually amazing. This is another reason why Lords of the Fallen just works, and why video game music is in such a unique and special position, because it doesn't need to play by any sort of rules. We can have traditional choral writing and also experiment with sharp, rhythmic, uncomfortable patterns with gorgeously unpleasant throat singing mixed together to create this beautiful, cacophonous, violent, and fascinating piece of music. If you're looking for a game with an awesome soundtrack that will enhance the experience, I think the Lords of the Fallen is definitely going to be that for you. It's a really, really, really interesting soundtrack that makes me want to play the game, that's for sure. If you like this, feel free to like and subscribe. There's more on the channel, and as always, thanks a ton, and I'll see you later. Bye.